Imagine walking into your childhood home, the place you've known your entire life, only to have a friend claim they saw something, or someone that shouldn't be there. A figure you thought you had left behind in the past, someone you loved and lost. This is not just a story, it's a real encounter, one that has haunted me ever since. Welcome to Sinister Stories, where today's tale will pull you into the unknown, where the line between the living and the dead blurs. But be warned, once you hear this story, you might start to question what's real and what's lurking in the shadows of your own memories. On an ordinary afternoon, I brought a friend over to my childhood home, a place filled with memories, some too painful to revisit. I had no idea that day would forever change the way I saw that house. My friend swears he saw a man sitting at the dining table, calmly watching him from afar. But that man wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be gone, buried in the earth years before. What my friend described sent chills down my spine because the figure matched my father perfectly, down to the last terrifying detail. Before we dive into this disturbing encounter, I need you to prepare yourself. This isn't just a ghost story. This is a moment where reality seemed to crack, just for a second, and something from beyond slipped through. If you're ready, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to Sinister Stories, and share this video with anyone who loves a good scare. But fair warning, after you hear what happened, you might start looking over your shoulder, wondering what could be watching from the corners of your own home. Now, let's step into the darkness together. The house where it all happened wasn't just any house. It was old, with creaking floors and walls that seemed to whisper in the dead of night. Built by my great-grandmother, the house had been in the family for generations. The moment you stepped inside, you could feel its age, like it had absorbed the emotions of everyone who had ever lived there. My father brought us to live in that house when I was a child, before he passed away. It was supposed to be a place of comfort, but after his death, it became something else. A constant reminder of loss, where the air always felt a little too thick, a little too heavy, especially when you were alone. The house was isolated, standing at the end of a long, narrow road surrounded by dense, towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. Even during the day, shadows clung to the corners of every room. There was always an odd silence hanging in the air, the kind that makes you feel like someone, or something, is quietly observing you from the darkness. The house had a presence. Sometimes, you could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Doors would creak open on their own, and windows would rattle at night, even when there was no wind. As a kid, I always thought it was just the house settling, until I grew older, and the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. That day, when I invited my friend over, it seemed like any other afternoon. The sky was overcast, the light dim, and there was a strange stillness in the air. The house loomed ahead of us as we walked up the path, its windows like dark eyes staring down at us. As we approached, I realized I had lost the key to the front door. Frustrated, I decided to retrace my steps, leaving my friend waiting by the open corridor near the terrace. The terrace was gated off, locked from the outside, so I knew he'd be safe. But there was something unsettling about leaving him alone in that part of the house. It was a quiet, almost forgotten area, where the walls seemed to echo with the weight of the past. The air felt colder as I walked away, a chill creeping down my spine as I headed back to search for the key. Little did I know, at that very moment, my friend was standing just outside the reach of something far more sinister than an old house's creaks and groans. By the time I found the key and returned, I would have no idea that my world, and his, was about to change forever. As I walked back to the house, clutching the key in my hand, an unsettling feeling began to gnaw at me. The air around the house had grown eerily quiet, as if the world itself had gone still, waiting for something to happen. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the pavement, the sound of each step bouncing off the walls like the house was listening, anticipating my return. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the anxiety of losing the key, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. It was a kind of silence that felt alive, like the calm before a storm. When I reached the corridor where I'd left my friend, I noticed he was standing stiffly, his face pale, and his eyes wide, as if he had seen something or someone. His hands were trembling slightly, and the color had drained from his face. "What's wrong?" I asked, but the words came out weak, like I was afraid of the answer. He didn't speak at first, just stared at me with a look of confusion and fear, as though he was trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Is your dad home?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My dad had been dead for years, and I never talked about him at school. My friend didn't even know about his death. "No," I replied, my voice shaky. "My dad's not here. He passed away a long time ago." My friend's expression shifted from confusion to horror. "But I saw him," he stammered, his eyes darting back toward the house. "I swear I saw him. He was sitting at the dining table, just looking at me. Tall, bald, kind of tan. He looked right at me." The description stopped me cold. My father had been a tall man, with light brown skin and a shaved head. The details my friend gave matched him perfectly. But how could he know that? He had never seen a photo of my dad, never heard me talk about him. Yet here he was, describing him like he just walked into the room and sat down. A deep, icy dread settled in my chest. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe he had seen a reflection, a trick of the light. But the fear in my friend's eyes was too real. He hadn't just imagined it. He was convinced of what he saw. The corridors suddenly felt darker, colder, like the walls were closing in around us. My friend's breath came out in shallow gasps, and I could see his hands trembling at his sides. I felt an overwhelming urge to look behind me, as if something, or someone, was standing just out of sight. But I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I didn't want to see. My heart pounded my chest, my palms slick with sweat as I fumbled to unlock the door. I told myself it was just a coincidence, just my friend's imagination playing tricks on him. But deep down, I knew something far more unsettling was at play, something that defied explanation, something that had been waiting for us in that house. My mind was racing, torn between disbelief and a growing sense of dread. There was no way my friend could have seen my father. He was gone, buried, and there was nothing left of him but memories. Yet, the fear in my friend's eyes was undeniable. He had seen something, and the description was too perfect to be a coincidence. Every instinct I had screamed at me to lock the door, leave the house, and never come back. But at the same time, curiosity, that dangerous lure, tugged at me. What if my friend wasn't imagining things? What if, somehow, my father had never truly left this house? I felt trapped in that moment, caught between the rational side of my mind that told me ghosts weren't real, and the undeniable chill creeping up my spine that told me otherwise. My friend was visibly shaken, and I could see him wrestling with his own thoughts, unsure whether to run or stay. He glanced nervously toward a dining room, where he claimed he had seen my father sitting, and then back at me, waiting for some sort of explanation. But what could I say? That my house was haunted? That my father's ghost was still here, watching us from the shadows? The words felt absurd even as they crossed my mind, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air inside the house felt thick, almost suffocating, as if we were being watched by unseen eyes. My friend's unease was contagious, and I could feel the tension building in the pit of my stomach. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of our breathing, and I realized I had to make a decision. Do we stay and investigate, confront whatever presence might be lingering here, or do we leave, pretending this never happened, burying the fear along with the memory of my father? My friend looked at me, his face pale, waiting for me to take the lead. As we approached the dining room, the air grew impossibly cold, like we had stepped into a freezer. The shadows stretched long and dark across the floor, twisting and distorting the familiar space into something alien, something wrong. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. I could feel my friend's anxiety radiating off him like a wave, his breath shallow and uneven. My heart raced in my chest, pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, to leave, but my legs kept moving, carrying me forward as if drawn by some unseen force. We stood at the entrance of the dining room, and for a moment, everything was still. My eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of what my friend had seen. The table was there, exactly as I remembered it, empty, untouched. But the feeling in the room was undeniable, oppressive, as if the air itself was alive with something unseen, something watching us. The chair where my father used to sit seemed to loom in the dim light, its presence heavy, as if the weight of his memory had never truly left. Then my friend whispered, "That's the chair. That's where he was sitting." His voice trembled, barely audible, and my blood ran cold. The description he had given was too accurate, too precise. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and stepped closer to the table. My fingers brushed the surface, feeling the cool wood beneath my skin, and in that moment, the temperature seemed to drop even further. I glanced at the chair, half expecting to see it shift, to see the shadow of a figure materialize before my eyes. But nothing happened. It was just a chair. But that didn't explain the feeling, the overwhelming sensation that we weren't alone. I could feel it now, stronger than ever, like a presence hovering just beyond the edge of my vision waiting. My friend took a step back, his eyes wide and darting around the room. "I don't think we should be here," he muttered, his voice shaking. I wanted to agree, to leave and never look back, but something in me, some part of me that still longed for my father, kept me rooted to the spot. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft creak, like the groan of an old door opening. We both froze, staring at the chair. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as the noise echoed through the room. Slowly, as if guided by invisible hands, the chair began to move. Just a few inches, but enough to send a surge of terror through me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt, the world spinning out of control. My friend let out a strangled gasp and bolted toward the door, but I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the chair, which had now stopped moving, but the presence was stronger than ever. It was here. Whatever my friend had seen, whatever had been watching him from that chair, it was still here, and it was aware of us. My skin prickled with fear, every hair standing on end as a cold breeze swept through the room, though no windows were open. The air felt electric, charged with something otherworldly, something ancient. And then, as quickly as it began, the movement stopped. The chair was still again, the room silent. But the feeling didn't leave. The presence lingered, heavy and malevolent, as if it were daring us to come closer, to acknowledge it. My friend's voice broke the silence, shaking with fear. "We need to go. Now." I couldn't argue. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't my father. It was something else. Something darker. Something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. As we backed out of the room, I could feel it watching us, following our every step. The sensation of eyes burning into the back of my skull was almost unbearable, but I didn't dare turn around. The terror that coursed through me was too real, too tangible. We stumbled out of the house, slamming the door behind us, and for a brief moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But deep down, I knew that whatever was in that house wasn't finished with us yet. We bolted from the house, our hearts pounding, breaths ragged, as we stood outside in the fading daylight. The oppressive weight of the air inside still clung to me, like something had latched onto my soul, refusing to let go. My friend leaned against the gate, his face pale, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with terror. But as much as I wanted to stay outside in the safety of the open air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that the house, or whatever was inside it, wasn't done with us yet. Then, in the silence between our gasps for breath, I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city. It was a whisper, low and sinister, coming from inside the house. My friend heard it too. His eyes snapped to mine, his face a mask of sheer horror. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, unable to speak. The whisper was faint, almost like a voice carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was calling my name. I felt my blood run cold, my stomach twisting into knots as the realization hit me. Whatever was in that house knew who I was. It wasn't just a random spirit or a lingering memory. It knew me, intimately, personally, and it wanted me back inside. The whispers grew louder, the voice insistent, like it was beckoning me to return, to finish what had been started. My legs felt weak, my body numb with fear, but against all logic, I felt an overwhelming urge to step back into the house, to face whatever waited for me. My friend grabbed my arm, pulling me back, his face pale with panic. "Don't go back in there," he pleaded. "Whatever it is, it's not your dad." His words sent a shiver down my spine. Deep down, I knew he was right. The figure my friend had seen, the presence we had felt, it wasn't my father. It was something darker, something that had taken root in the house long before we ever lived there. But the whispers, the voice, it was too familiar. It sounded like my father. Unable to resist, I took a step toward the house, my mind torn between fear and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, it really was my dad. Maybe he was trying to reach me, to tell me something, to give me one last message from beyond the grave. But as I stepped closer to the door, the whisper shifted, the tone changing from a soft murmur to a low, menacing growl. The air around us seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and suddenly, the house didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a predator, waiting to strike. The door creaked open on its own, a slow, deliberate movement that sent chills down my spine. And there, standing in the doorway, was a shadow. It wasn't fully formed, just a dark, amorphous shape, but I could feel its eyes, cold, hollow, and piercing, boring into me. My heart hammered in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that house as possible. But I was frozen, trapped in the gaze of that shadowy figure, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure shifted, stepping out of the darkness and into the dim light of the porch. And that's when I saw it, the unmistakable shape of my father. His tall, broad frame, his bald head, his familiar, worn clothes. It was him, but not. There was something wrong, something off about the way he moved, the way he looked at me. His eyes were empty, devoid of life, and his skin was a sickly, ashen gray. My friend let out a strangled gasp behind me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. As the figure moved closer, the truth hit me like a freight train. This wasn't my father. It had never been my father. Whatever was standing before me was something else entirely. Something malevolent that had taken his form, something that had been waiting in that house, feeding off the grief and fear that had festered there for years. The realization sent a surge of terror through me, and finally, my legs obeyed the command to run. I turned and bolted, my friend close behind, as the figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes locked on me. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more frantic, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. We ran until we were far from the house, far from the suffocating presence that had taken on my father's shape. But even as we stopped to catch our breath, I knew deep down that it wasn't over. The thing in the house had seen me, had recognized me, and it wasn't going to let me go easily. As we ran farther from the house, the cold, oppressive air seemed to lift, but the dread clung to me like a shadow. My friend and I didn't speak. We didn't need to. The terror in his eyes reflected my own thoughts. What we had seen, what had followed us, was beyond anything we could comprehend. My home, once filled with memories of my family and childhood, was now something else entirely. It was tainted, haunted by a dark force that had taken the form of my father, and I had no idea how or why. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something fundamental had been altered. I no longer felt safe, not even in my own skin. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that shadowy figure, its lifeless eyes staring at me, cold and calculating. It was as if the house had come alive, reaching out beyond its walls, its dark energy following me everywhere I went. I stopped going near the house altogether, but that didn't stop the dreams. The nightmares, to be more precise. Every night, I dreamed of that house. In the dreams, I was always standing in the hallway, looking into the dining room, where the figure of my father sat at the table, waiting. He never spoke, never moved, but the air was thick with a silent menace, as if he was daring me to come closer. And every time, just as I would step toward him, the dream would twist, his face would shift, his eyes would blacken, and the whispers would begin again, louder and louder, until I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that my grief for my father had somehow manifested in these hallucinations. But deep down, I knew better. My friend had seen him too, and he had no reason to lie. Whatever had taken my father's form wasn't confined to the house anymore. It had followed me. I could feel it watching, always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows of every room I entered. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, but the feeling was too strong, too pervasive to ignore. My friend refused to come near me after that day. I couldn't blame him. What we had experienced wasn't something that could be easily explained or forgotten. He said he felt wrong every time we talked, as if something dark lingered in the air between us. And honestly, I felt the same. The bond between us had been severed, tainted by the experience we had shared, and neither of us wanted to acknowledge the horrifying truth of what had happened. Weeks passed, and the figure never reappeared, but the feeling never left. I started to notice small, unsettling things. Objects in my apartment would move, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. A chair that had been pushed in would be pulled out when I turned around. The air would grow unnaturally cold at odd times, and once, I swore I heard the faint creak of a door opening, even though I lived alone. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was all in my head. But the truth was clear. Whatever had been in that house had followed me, and it wasn't going to leave. The climax of this haunting came one night when I woke up to the unmistakable sound of breathing in my room. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Someone or something was standing in the dark, just beyond the edge of my bed. My heart raced as I lay frozen, unable to move, every fiber of my being screaming at me not to look. But I had to. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner of the room, and there he was, the figure, my father, or at least something pretending to be him. He stood in the shadows, his face half hidden by the darkness, but I could see his eyes, black and empty, staring down at me. My blood ran cold as the whispers began again, low and insistent, just like they had in the house. I couldn't make out the words, but the meaning was clear. I wasn't safe. I would never be safe. The figure stepped closer, and I felt the air grow colder, my breath coming in shallow gasps as fear took hold of me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was trapped, frozen in place as the figure loomed over me. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. The whispers stopped, the air returned to normal, and the room was empty. But I knew, in that moment, that my life would never be the same. The thing that had taken my father's form was still with me, always watching, always waiting, and no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would always find me. The terror persisted in my life, a constant presence in the background. I had survived the encounter, but I knew deep down that this wasn't over. I would carry the weight of that haunting for the rest of my life, forever looking over my shoulder, wondering when the figure would return. It wasn't just the house that was haunted anymore. It was me. And no matter how hard I tried to move on, to forget the memory of that night, and the entity that wore my father's face would never leave me. Even now, months later, the experience haunts me like a shadow that I can't shake. Every corner I turn, every quiet moment, there's a sense that something is lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I've tried to move on with my life, to convince myself that what happened in that house, and the figure that followed me, was just a trick of the mind, a figment of my grief. But deep down I know the truth. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen, and some doors, once opened, can't be closed. The strangest part is that, on the surface, everything seems normal. My life has fallen back into routine. The nightmares have faded, and there are days where I almost convince myself that it's all behind me. But then, without warning, something will happen. Small, subtle, but enough to send chills down my spine. A picture frame on my desk will be tilted when I'm sure I left it straight. A cold draft will brush past me in an otherwise warm room. I'll hear the faint creak of floorboards behind me when no one else is there. It's never enough to prove anything, never enough to make anyone else believe me. But I feel it. It's always there. I've come to realize that the figure wasn't just an apparition or a hallucination born of my grief. It was something much older, something far more sinister. It wore my father's face, but that was just a mask, a lure to draw me in. Whatever it truly was, it had been in that house long before we ever lived there. I was foolish to think that it was bound to the walls of that place. It was never about the house. It was about me. The entity had marked me the moment I set foot in that house as a child, feeding on the grief that festered there after my father's death, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Now, as I sit in my apartment, far from that house, I can't help but feel like it's still watching me waiting. The memories play over and over in my mind like a loop. My friend's terrified expression, the icy air, the whispers, and, most of all, the hollow, lifeless eyes of the figure that claimed to be my father. I wonder if it's still there, in the house, waiting for its next victim, or if it's found another form, another way to enter my life. I wonder if I'll ever truly be free of it. The experience has left me changed in ways I can't fully explain. I've tried talking to others about it, but no one understands. They laugh it off, tell me it was just a nightmare, just my mind playing tricks. But I know better. I've seen what lurks on the other side, and I know that some things, some forces, are far beyond our understanding. They exist in the shadows, waiting for moments of weakness, feeding on fear, on grief. I made the mistake of letting it in, of listening to the whispers, of believing that it was something familiar, something safe. And now, I live with the knowledge that it's still out there. I can't explain how, but I know it's not finished with me. Every time I look into a mirror, every time I'm alone in the dark, I feel it. The presence is subtle, almost imperceptible, but it's there. A cold breath on the back of my neck, a flicker of movement just outside my peripheral vision. I've tried to move on, but the truth is, I don't think I'll ever escape it. It's marked me, claimed a part of me, and it's waiting for the right moment to come back. So, I share this story not to frighten you, but to warn you. Be careful where you go, and be mindful of the places where grief and pain linger. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that feed on the emotions we try to bury. They were the faces of those we've lost. They whisper to us in familiar voices, but they are not what they seem. If you ever find yourself in a place like that house, if you ever feel the cold grip of fear closing around you, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't listen. Don't follow the whispers. As I close this chapter of my life, I can't help but wonder if this is truly the end. I've left the house behind, but can you ever truly leave something like that behind? Maybe one day, I'll wake up and it will all be over. Or maybe, tonight, when the lights are out and the room falls silent, I'll hear the whispers again. And this time, I'll know. There's no escaping it. If you've ever experienced something similar, I invite you to share your story in the comments below. Maybe together, we can make sense of the things that go bump in the night. Maybe there's more of us out there than we realize. But be warned, once you open that door, it's hard to close it again. Be careful, and remember, some things are better left unseen.